2 cops, please.
2 for the cop, pound too much.
Please.
2 for the cop, £3.
Cop, a 3-letter word that's become synonymous with Liverpool FC.
2 for the cop, yeah, please.
Right, enjoy this, lad.
In comes Lawrenson!
Cop this, cop that, screamed the back pages. But why?
It's a sacred place. The ashes of dozens of men have been sprinkled. The place is it's a shrine, really.
Small word, towering tale.
In the first days of the 20th century, the British Empire was at war in South Africa.
The largest British army since Agincourt was suffering defeat after defeat at the hands of the Boers. A band of farmers descended from the original Dutch settlers.
The Boers claimed this land as their own. Gold made it worth fighting for.
In the town of Ladysmith, 13,000 British troops were under siege. A force, mostly made up of Lancashire regiments, was sent to relieve the town. Their way was blocked by 10,000 Boers and a 1,500-foot terraced hill. Spion Kop, or Spy Hill in Dutch, was the key to unlocking Ladysmith.
Many of these British soldiers were rescued from unemployment and poverty, recruited from cities and towns like Liverpool and my hometown, Preston.
Among the troops were the victorious footballers of the South Lancashire Regiment, led by their captain, Colour Sergeant John Nolan. Just months before, they had brought the Army Football Cup back to their barracks near Preston North End's Deepdale Ground.
At 10:30 on the night of January the 23rd, 1900, the British began their ascent on Spion Kop. In thick fog, the British troops scrambled up the rock in silence. That, apart from the regimental dog, who happened to bark. But straight away, the dog was silenced for good.
At 3:30 a.m, they reached a plateau, chasing off a small band of Boers with gunfire.
No need for secrecy now. The British let out the agreed signal that the summit of Spion Kop had been captured. And 3 cheers rang out across the veldt.
The troops dug trenches in the hard, rocky ground, but when the sun rose and the mist cleared, they realised they had just dug their own graves. Spion Kop was not the dominant crest in the region. It became hell on earth.
Louis Bode, who was leading the Boers, had the intimate knowledge of this terrain, and he had said to his men that he wanted his sharpshooters on the northeastern crest line. He wanted a Maxim Northfield gun on a ridge that runs between a feature known as Aloe Knoll and the Twin Peaks, and on the bigger of the Twin Peaks he positioned a Krupp gun. When the fog lifted that morning, the battle began. Those guns opened fire onto this position. Up until the mist had lifted, they didn't realise they were there.
In terms of digging in, the British troops had a real problem here, didn't they?
Apart from the surface rock here, about 18 inches below the surface is a shelf of dolerite, and that's as far as you're going to get. They ended up in very shallow trenches. Amongst the Boers, there were men who could shoot. You know, they'd grown up in a country where they'd had to shoot wild animals over a distance of 1,000 yards. That's why you get so many fatalities here, in that they cannot get the cover that they require.
The British were slaughtered in their hundreds. A killing field barely the size of a football pitch. Hemmed in by the corpses of their friends, the British troops could hear only gunfire and the cries of the dying. They fought all day, with rifle and bayonet, in 100-degree temperatures, with no water. As one soldier later wrote, "And then they started shelling us from both sides, and for the next 16 hours our noses were buried in the ground, except when we were firing." A brave and excitable young war correspondent by the name of Winston Churchill served as messenger between the generals below and the soldiers suffering up on the hill. Churchill implored the men not to surrender. The white flag, though, was starting to flutter. Colour Sergeant John Nolan saw his men begin to falter. As more and more started to surrender, he leapt in front of them shouting, "When I surrender, it'll be over my dead body." Inspired by his example, the South Lancashires held their position throughout that terrible day.
The history books refer to it as the Acre of Massacre. It remains the smallest piece of ground on which more men lost their lives in a single battle than any battle fought anywhere in the world up to current time. That's not to suggest that there weren't more men killed in battles, but never so many on such a small piece of ground.
When night fell, the guns fell silent. The British retreated off the hill, the morale in tatters. But tragedy turned into farce.
The Boers, who had suffered losses themselves in the close quarter fighting, also climbed down from their positions.
The summit was left to the dead and wounded.
At first light the next day, a few Boers returned to recover the bodies of their fallen. They saw that the British had gone. The hill and victory was theirs. If only the British had held their positions for a few more hours, they would have turned disaster into victory.
A small band of local volunteers climbed the hill to tend to the wounded.
One member of this Natal Ambulance Corps was a young Indian lawyer, Gandhi, making his first step onto the stage of history.
As for the footballers from Preston, well, they all survived to tell the tale.
One of the Lancashire lads, Private James Humphreys, was to owe his life to a tin of chocolate. A Christmas present to all the troops from Queen Victoria. It lay in his breast pocket and took a bullet from a Boer sniper.
Private Humphreys sent the tin with the bullet embedded with a note to his queen to say thanks.
Ladysmith was relieved the following month, and the British Army eventually won the South African War. Back in England in 1904, a group of football supporters named the terrace at their ground Spion Kop after the battle. The club? Woolwich Arsenal, in South East London, but when they moved north of the river, the club left the terrace nickname behind. 2 years later, in the Anfield area of Liverpool, a new tram line was being laid. The spoil from the work was heaped at the end of the local football ground. Ever ready to grasp an opportunity, the club used this great wall of earth to replace the small existing stand. It is believed that a band of supporters who had survived the horrors of Spion Kop named their new terrace in honour of their fallen friends. The shape of the hill reminding them of the battlefield. The sports editor of the Liverpool Echo took up the cause, and it caught on. More than 20 clubs named their terracing the Kop, but none became as famed as Anfield's. Not the original, but the best. And even now you can hear the crowd sing. As he lay on the battlefield dying, with the blood gushing out of his head. As he lay on the battlefield dying, these were the last words he said. "Oh, I am a Liverpudlian. I come from the Spion Kop. I like to sing, I like to shout. I go there quite a lot."